okay. And then I had another thought, which just escaped my mind. Let's go ahead and pretend I will think about it. Well, we see what happens.
Yeah, let's see. Well, people are joining. I'm not seeing you yet, though. Panelists, me.
I'm going to go to consensus right and wonder if I didn't.
The thing is, if you're not a panelist or a co-host, you won't be able to share your screen, I don't think.
Right. Very strange.
I'm gonna check with Alyssa.
Great. I'll be here and I'll be ready.
Good morning, everybody. We're getting set up and hope to start right on time. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Basic Orchid Care, the second in our series of webinars by Master Gardeners. Maureen Herther will be here this morning talking about orchids, basic orchid care. Oh, looks like we have someone from St. Augustine. Welcome. If you want to put in the chat where you're from, that would be interesting to know. We may have people from all over the state. And if you have questions, we ask that you use the Q&A button, which is down at the bottom. Hi, Maureen.
There we go.
How's
that?
Oh, that sounds good. Oh, and look at that beautiful orchid behind you.
I'm sorry?
You have a beautiful orchid as a backdrop.
It's Miss Coelogine Mariani, and it has 2 spikes and a total of 14 flowers.
Now, is that a virtual background?
Yes.
Or is, yes, okay, because it's a big orchid if that's the real thing.
It's really big. It's just beautiful though. I'm proud of this one. Can you hear me better now if I sit here?
Yes, that sounds very good.
Okay, great. And I blew up some slides too,
Okay.
so they'll look a little bit better. Try and get rid of my main background here, although nobody probably sees it. All right, here we go.
And one thing, Maureen, we are going to have to end right at 12 o'clock because we're right up against another webinar and we can't run two at the same time.
Okay.
So hopefully we'll get all the questions in. If not, people can email to the Manatee County Master Gardeners, manateemg@gmail.com.
Karen did forward me one.
Oh, good. From the last webinar?
Mm-hmm. And it was a very nice person who asked like real questions, you know.
Mhm.
And yeah, I got a nice reply from him.
Hey, good. I just wanted to jump in while I had a chance and make sure everything was going okay.
We're
Yeah.
okay right now.
Okay, good, good. Well, I'm here in the office if you need anything while you're going. Okay, Kathy, you can always send me a message in the chat in Teams, and I'll pop in. Okay?
Okay, thanks, Alyssa.
All right, thanks.
It's so we're going to go ahead and get started. We have about 41 participants with us. So thank you for joining us this morning for the second in our orchid series, Basic Orchid Care. This is part of our Master Gardener webinars, and the Master Gardener program is a extension program. And for those of you that may not be familiar with the extension service, it's a cooperative organization with the University of Florida and county government. So every county in Florida does have an extension office that you can go to for horticultural and agricultural information and education. My name is Oliver, and I'm a program assistant with the Master Gardener program here in Manatee County. And today we have with us Maureen Herthler. She is a Master Gardener with our program for many years and a wonderful orchid enthusiast. So she's quite knowledgeable, and we're very glad to have her with us this morning. If you do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A, and some I can answer as we go along, and others will, for the good of the group, Maureen will answer at the end. So it is recorded also, so you can watch this at a later date. And most of our webinars are up on our YouTube site, UF IFAS Extension, Manatee County. So with that, let's have Maureen take it away.
Good morning, everybody. Please ignore the puppies having fun behind me. As Kathy said, this is going to be a webinar on basic culture. And so allow me to go ahead and open that webinar and share my screen. Host disabled, participant screen sharing. Can you fix that, Kathy? Well, I'll start talking while Kathy figures out screen sharing. Behind me is Coelogine Mariani crossed with itself. So that's a primary hybrid. And this has 2 stalks with a total of 14 flowers, all of which opened. It has a few sunburned leaves, but apart from that, it's a nice healthy plant. It's huge, and I'm very, very happy with it. Hey, here comes Kathy. Great. All right. I'm starting at the end here for whatever silly reason. All right. All right, there we go. That should do it. All right. So as Kathy said, this is a 3-part seminar called, and this one is The World of Orchids, Part 2. And yes, I'm Master Gardener Volunteer Maureen. And, every one of these webinars has some objectives. This one is to provide for you essential information on how to choose an orchid and care for it. Then we'll discuss the 3 popular species that are grown here in Manatee County, and a little bit on the basics of fertilization. My disclaimer is that I'm not an orchid expert. There are many people with many ideas about how to raise orchids, but the information in this presentation mostly has been obtained from the American Orchid Society. I've also used the culture pages of some major growers. For the Cattleyas, there's Carter and Holmes, there's also Chadwick's. For Catasetum, Sunset Valley, and for Neophoenicia, which is one of my favorite orchids, there's New World Orchids and Orchid Limited. So you can see there's a lot of specialty places to buy orchids. There will be some brand names shown. As far as fertilizer is concerned, they're not recommendations from the university. The university doesn't endorse any particular specific brand, but this is for an illustration of what the bags might look like. All right, last time I had a fair number of questions about Florida native orchids, and my mind was not prepared. So I'm just going to give you a little presentation here on Florida native orchids. There are 120 different species. There are also natural hybrids, and so there are different color forms. Florida has more than half of the species found in the US, but there are only 4 species indigenous to Florida, and all the other ones have come from natural crosses or other types of cross-pollination. There's a great website, www.floridanativeorchids.com, and if you go to that, there's a tremendous amount of information. So last time we talked about the ghost orchid, and I believe I said it had no roots, which would be silly, but it has no leaves. And that's one of the reasons that it's difficult to find. There are only approximately 200 of them in Florida, mainly in the Everglades. Their official name is Dendrophylax lindenii. It was discovered in Cuba in 1844, but it was quite a bit later that in Florida it was discovered in the Everglades. This is a picture actually taken at Fairchild Botanical Gardens, which is the garden of the American Orchid Society. So if you're watching the different botanical gardens, you may get to see one like this in person. Of course, it's absolutely beautiful. This is just an up-close picture of the flowers. The ghost orchid, because there's only 2,000 of them, are an endangered species in Florida. So collecting them in the wild is a crime. But some people have started to clone them, and you may be able to purchase a clone. But again, you need to make sure it actually is a clone and it's from a reputable breeder. Some other ones. This is Encyclia tampensis. I have seen this one in Mayaca on the elevated walkway. It's pretty nondescript when it's not blooming, but it blooms beautifully. This is the clamshell orchid, Encyclia cochleata, and I call it the octopus orchid because that's what it looks like to me. If you have more interest in Florida native orchids, this is the book that I have sitting right next to me. Wild Orchids of Florida. And it's very comprehensive. And as you can see by the cover, it's very beautiful. Finally, other ways to appreciate native orchids. They have a pane of forever stamps, which are beautiful and can either be framed or used. And this is a site that I've had a lot of fun with. It's the North American Orchid Center.org, and they have a page on orchidgamy. So you can run, click on your favorite orchid, then you can run that sheet on some card paper that has the orchid parts all nice and colored and numbered for you. And then there is a page of instructions too, just in case you get a little stuck. These are not easy, but they are so much fun because you get to learn about the different parts of the orchid. It's a nice way to have fun. So back to buying an orchid. Most people start with orchids that are bought at big box stores. The advantage is that those orchids are usually a low cost. And so if you happen to lose the orchid, it's not a big expense. And educated buyers often find unusual hybrids. Some people like to buy the discount ones and try and resurrect them. So that's the advantage. Disadvantage is that you don't know where the orchid came from. You don't know how it was grown. You don't know what the health of it is. And they usually come potted in mulch or Phalaenopsis, and that's probably not the right media for Florida. The picture below is actually at a show, but having been in stores, that's pretty much the way they're displayed. They don't have names, obviously, but like I said, there are often some good buys. If you're choosing an orchid that way, you need to be aware of the cultural requirements of that orchid. Now, do you have the right conditions for it? Do you know how to care for it? And can you spot misleading information? The just add ice advice is wrong. Orchids are tropical plants. They don't really like ice against their roots. It is a way to measure the amount of water, but there are other simpler and correct ways. The other orchid is the blue orchid. Blue orchids from big box stores are actually white orchids that have been dyed. So the next time this one blooms, it will be white. It still may be beautiful. Back to big box orchids. When you're buying an orchid, buy roots, not flowers. If you gently pull the plant up, you can see if it has good roots, which are clearly visible, or they may have not very good roots. So you want to buy roots. You look for healthy green leaves, and it's important to check for pests, especially mealybugs. And if you're new to orchids, don't try to rescue a discount orchid. It's just not worth the effort to do that. So I like to tell people that when they're first starting, that I really would advise them to get a good quality plant. But again, there's nothing wrong with starting with a big box orchid. But reputable plants from local growers, it will grow in our conditions here. It's guaranteed disease-free. It'll give you a healthy plant with a name on it, which becomes important if you want to do anything or show your orchids anywhere. And when you buy it, the grower's present there, and he or she can answer any questions about the culture, our conditions, fertilizing. So you get a lot of specific information. This is a picture taken at one of our local growers. This is something in the Cattleya Alliance. But you can see that these are healthy plants, healthy leaves, no spots, just beautiful. Other sources include local orchid shows. Both Manatee County and Sarasota County have excellent orchid societies. There are many online growers, and that's mostly where I get my orchids from now, once you figure out the most reliable ones. Local orchid enthusiasts will often give you a division. In the AOS directory, they have a list of AOS recommended vendors. And there's also an AOS Facebook page where you can make contact with other orchid enthusiasts. I don't recommend buying from eBay or Etsy until you have a very good knowledge of what you're getting, because people have been disappointed. This is just a picture of from Sarasota Orchid Society. There is one, of course, in Manatee County as well. Actually, there is one in Manatee County. But all of the orchid shows have vendors with beautiful orchids for sale. So good, you know how to get your orchid. So orchids, of course, have basic requirements for their culture. Like all growing things, they require water, they require light, they require air movement, and they require some sort of food source. If you hang the right plant in the right place, it usually does very well. The Phalaenopsis is lashed to a tree. They do very well under oak trees. I have only palm trees, and my back faces west, so there's just way too much sun back there for that. And then you see one mounted on cork or wood, maybe driftwood. I do a lot of mounting this way. So when you are thinking about orchid, it helps to research a little bit what the natural habitat is. Some orchids like it really warm, and some like it really cool. Does the orchid grow in shade, sun, or some type of filtered light, as like you would get from the rainforest? What kind of humidity do they like? Are they epiphytic, that is with bare roots, or terrestrial, that grow in the ground? And when do they bloom? So the pictures here, the top is of a Phalaenopsis, which mostly enjoys our weather unless it gets too hot or too cold. This is a filtered light shade-ish loving plant. It loves humidity. It's epiphytic, so you can mount it on a tree or a slab or keep it in its pot. And its blooming season for the majority of them is the spring, and so we're past that. The other orchid is a Masdevallia, and it is in the rainforest. This is a native picture. They like it cool and humid. So they may not be the best orchid to grow here if you're growing outside. So yes, they like filtered light. And this is again Phalaenopsis growing on an oak tree. If you have questions about the things I've just mentioned, the American Orchid Society website and your home orchid societies will have culture sheets. These mention the general care of your orchids, but it may not be specific to your local area. So that's why it's advantageous to belong to one of the orchid societies, because there will be a tremendous amount of information about how to grow orchids in this area. And of course, you can always ask a master gardener. This is just a picture of what an AOS culture sheet looks like. Tells you how to pronounce the name, thank goodness. Tells you how much light it needs, temperatures, and information like that. For example, the Oncidium likes warmth, 55 to 60 degrees at night, 80 to 85 during the day, and 95 to 100 if it's humid with great air movement. So that's really helpful to know. All right, the essentials of orchid growing. Water. The first question is what's their native habitat like? Is it wet? Is it damp? Or is it dry? How much humidity do they like? You have to think about the potting media. Most orchids come potted in moss, but there's many bark mixes and inorganic mixes that you can use. Decide if you want to have it mounted. You need to decide on the type of pot, clay pots, plastic pots. And it's very important in your pot to have drainage. You don't want any sitting water. Most orchids die from overwatering. I've had mine outside in a shade house, and last summer I had a fair amount of loss because of all the rain we had. The Phalaenopsis to the side has crown rot, which is one of the most common diseases that result from overwatering. It's a fungus, and it attacks the plant at its crown, which is where Phalaenopsis grows new leaves. And so it's usually fatal. Next, all water is not the same. City water is usually safe, but it's a good idea to test it for its pH and salinity. Orchids are pretty tolerant of middle type pHs, but you should know if you have a high pH or salt water contained in your water. Reclaimed water is usually unsafe because it has a very high salinity. That means it's got a lot of salt. Well water is the same way. The salt has come in from underground. And rainwater is very pure, but it doesn't have any nutrients because it's really pure. I use a lot of rainwater in a rain barrel. There's no problem around here to keep rain barrels filled. So the big question, most common question that I get is how much and how often do you water? So for potted orchids, the best way to water them is to give them a full soak in your sink or a bucket for probably 10 minutes. And if they're mounted, then you water them first, and then you water them again. And if they're mounted, you're probably doing this every day or every other day. How often do you water? Well, it depends on the needs of the plant, depends upon what potting media and pot type you're using, and it depends upon the general temperature and humidity. So this is where the culture sheets are very, very helpful. Many people use the light pot method when after you water the plant, it's pretty heavy, and you come by and wait and check it every once in a while. It gets really light. They water it. That does tend to work for Phalaenopsis. I use clear pots, so I can see condensation on the inside, so I usually don't water until that's gone. And some people just water their plants on a schedule, whether they need it or not, and depending upon what type of plants you have, you can do that. So light, again, determined by their natural habitat, what their health requirements are, and what their flowering requirements are. Orchids need a certain amount of light to flower. And so one of the things we recommend if your orchid isn't flowering is to get it a little more light. How much light? Well, you can get information from growers, the culture sheets. There are light charts and light meters. There is an application for your phone that is a light meter, which is excellent. I use that. And there are also more expensive light meters, like you see, that you can buy that also have some additional features. And the one up above is called the Lux Light Meter Pro. So the adjustments you can make is you can reposition your plant. Obviously, if getting sunburn, that's not a good idea. If they're not getting enough light, if they're getting too a little light, and I'll talk to you about that in a minute. Most of us use shade cloth. On the greenhouse, the panels provide a fair amount of shade, about 15%. And so I use 50% shade cloth on top of that, with a small area uncovered for people who for orchids that like bright light. So light effects. The first one shows too much light. The leaves are just not happy. They're dark. You're losing one. It's just not a happy looking orchid. The middle shows when they're fine. They're a lighter green color. They're nice and plump, and that's a healthy plant. Not enough water. You see the accordion effect on the leaves. So that's sort of how you can tell how you're doing with light. This is a phalaenopsis, by the way. Humidity. All orchids like humidity. Of course, they can have the kind of humidity that we have here, or the kind of humidity that they have in a rainforest or a cloud forest. Everybody likes humidity. Air movement. This is especially important if you have high humidity. Most people use some sort of fan around their orchids, unless they just have a few. Air movement keeps the water from accumulating at the base of the leaves or in the crown, where it can cause rotting. And air movement helps to prevent some of the fungal disease, such as crown rot, water spots, or fungus. So air movement is one of the essential things needed. The next big question that I often get is, do I need to fertilize? Some people don't, and they have wonderful, beautiful orchids. Plants latched to growing trees get more natural organic nutrients, but again, they may need some occasional fertilization or not. Bare root orchids, the ones that are mounted, and those in inorganic media, think of it, bark and lava rock, they need consistent fertilization because there's nothing there for them. And a little fertilization is much better than more. High fertilization will cause burning of the roots, and of course, we don't want that. So a little bit about fertilizer. You'll see on the fertilizer bag some numbers, and they refer to the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that's present in that fertilizer. You also want one with micronutrients, particularly the trace elements and magnesium and calcium, and that will also be shown on the label. If you're new, the best thing to do is to start with a basic 10-10-10 fertilizer with micronutrients. That really provides the basic fertilization, and it's a reliable way to start. There are other options. And again, there are as many opinions on feeding your orchids as there are orchid growers. There are a couple different formulations that do different things. The first number is usually nitrogen, which is usually something that encourages green growth. So Jack's, which is a reliable food, has a lot of nitrogen and some potassium and phosphorus. So this is a great orchid fertilizer if you want to encourage growth of leaves, particularly in the beginning of the year. Jack's also makes what's called a bloom booster, which is a 396. And a lot of blooming orchids, of course, at the orchids getting ready to bloom, they don't need any more green growth, but they do need a fair amount of phosphorus. So that's the reason that you see a different type of fertilizer here. I use MSU formula, and that's pretty popular as well. That's a 13-3-15. And you can see that these, it's not so much the numbers itself, it's the ratio. So I use this for growth and for most of the season. But then I will switch to a bloom booster when I see enough growth. But again, you don't have to do all this stuff. So there is a lot of discussion about micronutrients and growth hormones in the orchid community. The micronutrients are, of course, essential, and they usually are included in your fertilizer, but check the label. They include calcium, magnesium, manganese, iron, zinc, copper, boron, and molybdenum. And these are things that are all important to appropriate cell function, appropriate root function. Occasionally, I will give my orchids a little extra bit of CalMag mixed in with the food. And there's a lot of discussion, of course, too, about growth hormones and vitamins. The role of these is unclear. Some have been tested and some have not been tested. And it's really up to the grower if they like a particular product and they think it's helping, or again, you may not use one at all. Super Thrive is what I use. It's got a lot of vitamins and minerals. It's 1 drop in a gallon, so it's pretty powerful. But again, other people use all kinds of different additives to their foods. Right, the most important thing is to please follow the directions. Read the label. The label is the law, and follow directions. You don't want to put in any more fertilizer than it calls for. All right, watering. That's another big question I get. Orchids do like a semi-regular schedule. So, if you want 1 week or 2 weeks, try and keep to that. The schedule depends upon the things we talked about, the type of media, the size of pots, and of course the plant preference. Mounted baskets and inorganic media plants need to be watered daily. So here's a lovely Vanda, which needs to be watered daily because it's got roots, just bare roots. You water these until they turn green, and that may be up to 5 or 10 minutes a plant. Here are ones mounted. They're on tree fern slabs, which I love, but have been hard to get. And again, they all need to be watered every day. This is a Cattleya, and it needs to be watered when it's completely dry. So it's hard to resist, but you need to let it get dry. So back to schedules. The fertilization schedule, that depends upon the plant requirements, of course. Many plants have a dormant period in the winter, and so they wouldn't require as much water or fertilization. Recommended for fertilization is to use half-strength fertilization 3 out of 4 weeks, and then the 4 weeks, make sure you water with clear water to wash out the salts. You water first. That way the leaves, or the roots, have begun to open their pores. They have a covering called vellum. So that begins to open up and relax a bit, and then your fertilizer gets better absorption. There are heavy feeders. I have a couple heavy feeders that do need more fertilizer. But again, culture sheets are what's going to help you. All right, everybody loves talking about fertilizer. So just remember 10, 10, 10. A little bit about Phalaenopsis. They should never completely dry out, but to be nearly dry when watered. And you can tell this is going to be a skill thing. It's going to be practice. They like humidity, but it's not, they don't have to have super humidity. There are some pictures here. The wrinkly leaf can be overwatering or underwatering. So that's tough. And that's when you knock it out of the pot to see what the roots are doing. We've already seen an example of crown rot, and that's not pretty. So Phalaenopsis are usually grown on your lanai with an east exposure. In a greenhouse, they need a lot of shade, but the Orchid Society culture sheets tells me exactly how much light is required. It tells you the temperatures, and it does require a short period of cooler nights to flower. And luckily, we usually get that. Most of the Phalaenopsis like to show off in the spring. This is my friend Jeannie's Phalaenopsis. It's a V3. It's show quality. It's absolutely gorgeous. She grows this on her lanai with an east exposure, and she waters it every 2 weeks by the soaking method. This is mine. It's not like Jeannie's, so I guess I have to talk to her more about culture. This is another one of hers. This is BLC Happy Girl. This is a Harlequin type Phalaenopsis, and obviously it's gorgeous. Phalaenopsis spikes look like the small tube that you see. A lot of times people confuse these with roots, and as it grows, you'll see that it's actually a spike. You also see how the buds look and what the flowers are like, and they're usually opening from the base to the tip. Reblooming. Another popular question is, what do I do with the spike? If you want your plant to continue to be high quality producers, then you could cut the stalk completely off as low as you can. That means all of the nutrients of the plant are going to stay with the plant. But if you cut between nodes, you may get your Phalaenopsis to rebloom, but it won't be as vigorous, and you don't know how it'll affect the next year's blooming. But cut the spike. This is one of my orchids in the Cattleya Alliance, and it's growing pretty well. So for the Cattleyas, it needs about the same humidity as the phals. Mature Cattleyas need to dry out thoroughly before being watered again, and they like fairly high light. You can see the one Cattleya with all the wrinkled pseudobulbs. I think that needs a little better watering. And the one from someone's shade house there looks excellent with nice plump bulbs. All right. So 50 to 70% full sun. And again, the leaves should be that medium green color. What do they look like? When they bud, they bud into a sheath, and then the flowers come out of the sheath. And don't be so quick to cut or be upset about dried sheaths. Many Cattleyas actually bloom from dry sheaths, so just let them alone. This is my Curtis Wayne Compton. And this is Cocoa Head, which just bloomed for me with four nice flowers about 5 inches across. So the Oncidiums, Shari Baby, the chocolate orchid, the dancing lady. Oncidiums can be thin-rooted and thin-leaved varieties, and they need a little more frequent watering because the roots can't hold water. They need to partially dry out between waterings. And again, that depends upon the type of media you're using and the pot size. They don't need as much humidity, as the other orchids, but they certainly don't mind humidity. So they need bright to nearly direct sun, which with the thin leaves you would think would not be very helpful. And a little bit cooler temperatures, which basically here would be the fan. This is Twinkle Pink Perfusion. And a quick story, I had probably 6 Shari babies that didn't bloom for me. One was almost 8 years old. And I got really angry at them, and I put them in nearly direct sun. So when you do that, the leaves tend to get spotted, and the plant doesn't look that healthy, but every one of mine bloomed this year, so lesson learned. Oncidiums put out these small spikes. I don't think you can really confuse them with anything else. And this is what one looks like in bud. So usually Oncidium are smaller flowers. So I think we're doing well on time. So this is what has been happening now in my greenhouse. This is a Paphiopedilum wolf's folly. I have had difficulty blooming these, so this was actually the first one that I've rebloomed. It's a pretty nice flower, except you'll notice that the sepals are different. One has nice straight lines, and the other one looks like a wing, a butterfly wing. And this is called a pyloric mutation. There's no reason for it. And the next time this one blooms, it may be perfectly normal. This is a Wanagara apple blossom. I would highly recommend buying this plant. It comes in a number of different colors. And it has so much fragrance that it literally will fill your house. And is a beautiful fragrance. This is not all that hard to grow. And like I said, if you get a chance to buy it, this is a good orchid. This is a Laeliocattleya Trick or Treat Orange Magic. And you can certainly see that it is orange magic. A lot of times I buy new hybrids from Carter and Holmes. And so you have to wait a couple of years. And this was one in the Cattleya Alliance. I can't really remember its name, but it looks like this is just going to be a beautiful orchid as it grows bigger. This is the coconut orchid. These are not the best pictures, but this orchid does truly smell like coconut. This one's being grown in semi-hydroponics, which is a material called aliflor or hydroton, which are basically absorptive little rocks. And it retains water and fertilizer in the bottom, and then is absorbed by the rocks. And it's another way to grow. I like to play around with this coconut orchid. Obviously, it's very happy there. This is the octopus or a clamshell orchid. This is a hybrid of several things, but it still has the characteristics of the clamshell orchid or the octopus orchid. I do some Japanese fukuran, which are samurai orchids. This is little Yodomatsu, who was nice enough to bloom for me this year. And this is cherry blossom crossed with purple fantasy, again, Neophoenicias. And this one's a bloom, it's their first bloom. It's not really exciting. The petals aren't really well formed. It looks like I may have some that are going to blight and fall off. But it's a first bloom, and that's always a start. It tells you that your culture is good. And this one I think we saw in the very beginning. This is Coelogine Mariana cross self. It's primary hybrid. And I'm especially proud of this one. This is the first bloom for me. I think I've had the plant probably a little more than 2 years. And it surprised me with this beautiful display. So just another quick one. This is Paphiopedilum Jerry Spence. This is again a first bloom for me. This is not the happiest plant or happiest bloom. You can see some wrinkles in the sepals that don't really stand up well. It's a relatively small flower. This should be a flower that blooms in multiples. So it's not quite right yet. And this is a picture of the lovely greenhouse that my husband has just finished building me. The real problem that I found with my culture was just water. Everything was just getting too much water. So I've moved them into this greenhouse where they won't get so much water and I can meet their light requirements, and I'm hoping to have better success. All right, so everybody's favorite time, questions. We certainly have enough time for multiple questions. And so Kathy will be reading them in the Q&A, and then she'll ask me, and hopefully I can answer.
Great, thank you, Maureen. It's great to know that, you know, really one size doesn't fit all with orchids. You really do need to do your research to figure out how to treat them. We do have some questions, so let's get started on those. First of all, we would like to know, how big are those orchids behind you? What is their actual size?
This one's obviously magnified a little bit, but it is a big It's the flowers are probably, flower stalks are maybe 10 inches high. This is a big orchid.
So the flowers themselves are about 5 inches across, would you say?
No, they're
Not that big?
no, not that big. They're probably 2.5,
Ah,
about
okay.
that size. But of course, like the twinkle oncidiums are little tiny orchids. I do grow some miniatures, and that one, when it bloomed, the flower was the size of a dime. So yeah, they come in all sizes.
There we have a few cultural questions. Amanda asks, my orchids are potted in clear plastic with bark. These pots then sit in decorative pots. Do the decorative pots restrict airflow too much, particularly after soaking? She's worried about overwatering and underdraining or just too much dampness in the roots.
There are some orchid folk who will tell you not to put them in a decorative container unless you're taking them to a show or having company or something like that. If you use the decorative pot with the plastic one inside it, you have to make sure that that decorative pot has a hole for drainage into the saucer. For phalaenopsis, you can really pretty much use that. You just need to keep an eye on the roots for when it's time to repot, because then they may get too crowded. But probably keeping them in the pot and letting them thoroughly drain after you water them will not really hinder their growth.
Okay, Hyacinth says my orchids outside are soaked from all the rain, as you mentioned. What should I do? 2 of them have brown spots already.
It depends, of course, where you have them. If they're on trees, you sort of just have to go with nature. But other places, you can move them to areas with less rain, like I'm going to do at the greenhouse, your lanai. But here in Florida, it's just one of the hazards, is that things get soaked from the rain. When we had the tropical storm, I had my little samurai orchids, and I didn't bring them inside. And just in that little bit of time, the roots rotted, and I think I lost 3 or 4 of them. So that's one of the hazards, and the fungus that comes with that, is just something that happens here.
Okay, Laura says she has an orchid hanging in the shade of her oak tree, and the top of the leaves are turning yellow. Is that too much light? The crown appears green and no lost leaves.
Yeah, it probably is a little too much light. Over fertilization could be another problem of leaf tips turning yellow or brown. But again, sometimes that's just also the natural way that the leaves go, but it probably is a little bit more sun to the leaves than it would like.
Okay. Do plastic pots need air holes along the sides instead of just the bottom drainage holes?
Need. I don't know the answer to that. I grow in pots that have drainage holes on the right angle where the side meets the bottom. There are some other plants called carousel pots, which have a lot of slits for opening. Really, you can't go wrong with pots that have holes on the side or, increase the air movement. You really can't. So again, it's just personal preference.
Do you have any experience with jewel orchids?
I have some. Jewel orchids are very easy to raise. They do best indoors. They're a shade orchid. And they are really grown for the foliage. There are a lot of different patterns. And then they usually bloom with some small white flowers. They're easy to propagate. And they're a fun orchid to have around. I haven't grown one in, 10 years or so. So as far as culture, actual culture, I'd have to look that up.
Can you pot more than one orchid together?
No, that doesn't really help the orchids because they may have different requirements. It's just something that orchid growers just don't do.
Here in Florida, what kind of potting mix do you recommend?
In the last webinar, I talked about the basic potting mix that I use, which is a bag of bark mix, a bag of perlite, which is basically inorganic, and then a bag of charcoal, which is organic but gives some space. This is a mixture then that has the bark to retain some water, but also some things that improve airflow and drainage. That's what I use. There are also a couple commercial mixes that I use when I'm too lazy. The only thing that I recommend for Florida is not to use moss because that just holds too much water. And make sure if you use a bark mix that it's actually a mix, not just plain bark. So those are the things that I basically do my potting with.
Excellent. We have a few more questions about the orchid behind you. How many years old is it?
I bought this mature size, which probably is about 3 years old. And then, like I said, I had the 2 years before it bloomed.
Mhm.
I buy a lot of things, mature size or seedling size, because it's a lot less expensive.
That's pretty much it. There was one question about the orchid gami that you mentioned. Is that like origami, but you're making orchid flowers? Is
It
that
is.
correct?
Yes, it's not origami in the sense that you only use one sheet to make the flowers, but the basic technique is the folding, the mountain and the valley and things like that. And it really is fun.
Yes, and sounds like a great way to learn your orchids too.
Mhm.
Well, we have no more questions. And so I want to thank everybody who joined us today for Maureen's talk. And next week at the same time, Maureen will be covering advanced orchid care. So we're progressing along in our orchid series. And thank you, Maureen, for the wonderful information.
And Melissa for organizing this.
And we hope to see everybody next week. Thank you again for joining us. Bye.
All right. Goodbye, everybody.